My name is Hazel. I was 11 years old when my mom handed me $2, kissed my forehead, and left for Europe for an entire month. She thought she was giving me an emergency fund. She didn't realize she was actually paying the price to lose me forever. The air in the hallway smelled like expensive jasmine perfume and anxiety. My mother, Eleanor, was a whirlwind in a silk blouse, stuffing things into a suitcase that cost more than our car. "Hazel, honey, don't look so glum. It's just 4 weeks. You're practically a grown-up anyway," she said, snapping the latches shut. She checked her reflection in the hall mirror, smoothing her blonde hair, not seeing me standing behind her. I was 11. I was wearing jeans with patched knees and a t-shirt that was getting too tight under the arms. I didn't feel grown up. I felt small, like a pebble caught in her shoe. "Where are you going again?" I asked, my voice quiet. "Europe, darling, Italy, to find myself, to breathe." She turned and grabbed my shoulders. Her hands were cool and smelled like lotion. "You'll be fine here. It's summer break. Sleep in, watch TV until your eyes bleed. It'll be an adventure." Outside, a taxi horn blasted 3 times. She flinched. Okay, I'm coming." She scrambled for her purse and pulled out her wallet. "Here, for emergencies." She pressed something into my palm. I looked down. 2 crisp, green $1 bills. George Washington stared back at me, looking as unimpressed as I felt. "Mom, this is $2, I said. "There's plenty of pasta in the pantry, and the tap water is perfectly drinkable. Don't be dramatic, Hazel." She kissed the air near my cheek, missing the skin entirely. "Be good, don't burn the house down. I love you." She grabbed the heavy suitcase, and the door swung open, letting in the hot, humid air of the suburban afternoon. Then the door slammed shut. The lock clicked. I stood in the hallway. The jasmine scent faded instantly, replaced by the smell of old carpet and dust. I heard the taxi doors slam, the engine rev, and the tires crunch on the gravel driveway. Then silence, a thick, heavy silence that pressed against my ears. I walked into the kitchen. It was spotless. The refrigerator hummed its steady, boring tune. I looked at the $2 in my hand, crinkling them until my knuckles turned white. "An adventure," I whispered to the empty room. I went to the pantry and opened the door. A half-empty box of spaghetti and a dusty jar of marinara sauce sat on the shelf. It felt less like food and more like a prop in a play that had already ended. I closed the pantry door and went to the living room, turning on the TV just to hear a human voice. I sat on the couch, clutching the $2, waiting for the feeling of freedom to kick in. It never did. The first 2 days were a lie. I spent them draped over the sofa, eating dry cereal straight from the box and watching reruns of game shows. I felt like a queen in a dusty castle. I didn't have to brush my teeth if I didn't want to, and I certainly didn't have to listen to Eleanor complain about the negative energy in the kitchen. But on the morning of day 4, the world changed. I woke up because the air felt heavy. It was thick and wet, sticking to my skin like a damp wool blanket. Usually, the air conditioner kicked in with a comforting thrum and a puff of cool air, but the house was dead silent. I sat up, peeling my back away from the leather sofa. I walked to the kitchen and flicked the light switch. Nothing. I tried the faucet. A pathetic, rusty trickle of lukewarm water gasped out before stopping entirely. My heart gave a sharp, painful tug in my chest. "Mom?" I whispered. The word felt stupid as soon as it left my lips. She was halfway across the Atlantic by now. I opened the refrigerator door. The little light inside didn't turn on. The smell hit me immediately, a sweet, sickly scent of milk turning sour and deli meat beginning to sweat. In the back, a bowl of leftover casserole was already fuzzy with white mold. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in short, jagged bursts. I ran to the pantry. I needed that pasta. I needed something that wouldn't rot. I grabbed the box of spaghetti and ripped the top open, but I didn't find noodles. I found movement. Dozens of tiny, dark weevils were crawling through the dry pasta, their hard shells clicking against the cardboard. I dropped the box. It hit the floor, spilling the infested noodles across the linoleum. I backed away, my stomach turning a slow, nauseous somersault. I ran to the hall table and grabbed my mother's emergency fund. The $2. They felt so light, like they might float away if I didn't squeeze them. I went to the front window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtains. The sun was a blinding white disk in the sky. Out on the street, the world looked normal. Mr. Henderson was watering his lawn. A dog barked 3 houses down. They didn't know that inside this house, the life support had been cut off. I looked at the phone on the wall. No dial tone. The bill hadn't been paid. Eleanor hadn't just left me for a month, she had left me in a tomb that was slowly heating up to 90 degrees. I took a deep breath, trying to swallow the lump of panic in my throat. I couldn't sit here and wait for the milk to finish rotting. I had $2 and a stomach that was starting to growl. I went to my room, laced up my sneakers tight, and tucked the $2 into my sock. If I was going to survive until she came back, I had to stop being a child and start being a ghost. The pavement burned through the thin soles of my sneakers as I walked down the main road. The heat shimmered off the blacktop in wavy lines, making the suburban houses look like they were melting. My stomach felt like it was folding in on itself, a hollow, aching reminder that my last meal had been a bowl of dry, sugary flakes 24 hours ago. I reached Miller's Hardware and General, a place that smelled of sawdust, motor oil, and air conditioning. I stood in the doorway for a long beat, just letting the cold air wash over my sweaty face. I walked to the back, where the garden supplies were kept. I had $2. I could buy a single candy bar and a soda, and I'd be full for an hour, or I could try to stretch time. I looked at the seed packets. They were colorful and bright, promising life in exchange for a bit of dirt and water. I found what I was looking for: cherry bell radishes, ready in 22 days. Next to them, black-seeded Simpson lettuce, ready in 28 days. They were 99 cents each. The cashier, a man with thick glasses and a name tag that read Artie, looked at me over the rim of his spectacles. "Just the seeds, kiddo? Planting a garden?" "Yes, sir," I said, my voice sounding raspy. I placed my 2 crumpled bills on the counter. "Gonna be a hot one for planting. Make sure you water 'em twice a day," he said, sliding the packets into a small brown paper bag. "No tax on seeds in this state. You're all set." I stepped back out into the furnace of the afternoon. I didn't go home yet. Instead, I headed toward the park. I knew where the recycling bins were. The first bin was a gold mine: 3 aluminum soda cans and 2 plastic water bottles. In our state, those were 5 cents apiece. I felt a strange, electric jolt of pride as I fished them out. I wasn't a girl looking for toys anymore. I was a scavenger. By the time I got back to our house, my hands were sticky with dried soda, and my face was flushed deep red. I went to the backyard, away from the prying eyes of the street. I found a patch of dirt near the porch where the soil felt soft. Using a sturdy stick, I dug narrow trenches. I dropped the tiny pebble-like seeds into the earth one by one. I covered them gently, patting the dirt down. "Grow," I whispered. "Please grow fast." I didn't have a hose that worked, so I took an empty milk jug I'd rinsed at the park fountain and poured the water over the rows. The dry earth drank it up with a thirsty hiss. That night, I didn't sleep on the couch. It was too hot. I dragged a sheet onto the linoleum kitchen floor. It stayed cooler than the carpet. I laid there in the dark, listening to the house creak. I was hungry, so hungry I felt dizzy, but I closed my eyes and pictured the tiny green sprouts pushing through the dirt. I had 26 days left. I had $0, but I had a row of hope in the backyard and a bag of clinking cans in the garage. I wasn't just waiting for Eleanor anymore. I was competing with her. By day 7, I had learned how to be invisible. The house was a furnace by noon, so I developed a circuit. I would wake up at dawn, crawl out to the backyard, and check my investments. To my disbelief, the radishes had already broken through, tiny, pale green hearts pushing aside the crusty earth. I gave them their morning drink from my scavenged water jugs, then I headed out before the neighborhood fully woke up. The local library became my cathedral. It was 3 miles away, a long walk for a girl with an empty stomach, but the reward was air conditioning and a bathroom with a lock. I would slip through the heavy glass doors, the cool air hitting my skin like a physical blessing. I went straight to the bathroom. I washed my face with the foaming pink soap until my skin squeaked. I drank from the porcelain fountain until my belly felt heavy and sloshing. Then I would find a corner in the children's section, hide behind a stack of oversized picture books, and sleep. Nobody looks twice at a kid in the library during summer break. I was just another bookworm, or so they thought. They didn't see the way I checked the trash cans in the lobby for half-eaten granola bars or discarded apples. On the walk back, I did my audit. I carried a heavy-duty trash bag I'd found in our barrage. I walked the perimeter of the park and the back of the strip mall, eyes glued to the ditches. Clink, clink, crunch. Each aluminum can was a nickel. 20 cans meant $1. $1 meant a loaf of the generic white bread that tasted like sawdust but felt like a feast. As I turned the corner toward our driveway on day 10, my bag heavy with 12 cans and a glass bottle, I saw her, Mrs. Gable. She was standing on her porch, clutching a pair of gardening shears. She was ancient, with skin like a crumpled paper bag and eyes that looked like they could see through brick walls. She wasn't looking at the street, she was looking at our house. Specifically, she was looking at the way the mail was spilling out of our box and the fact that the grass was starting to look like a hayfield. I froze, pulling my bag of trash behind my legs. "Hazel?" she called out, her voice thin and sharp. "That you, child?" I felt a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the heat. If she knew I was alone, she'd call the police. If they called the police, they'd put me in a home. And if I went into a home, I'd lose the only thing I had left, the house I was supposed to keep safe for a mother who didn't want me. "Hi, Mrs. Gable," I said, forcing my voice to sound light, the way Eleanor's did when she was lying to a bill collector. "Is your mother in there? I haven't seen her car in a week, and that mail is a disgrace." She's got the flu," I lied, my heart hammering against my ribs. "She's sleeping. I'm just helping out with the recycling." Mrs. Gable squinted, her gaze dropping to my dirty shins and the oversized t-shirt that was now stained with ditch water. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She just snipped her shears, snip, snip, and nodded slowly. "Is that so?" she said. "Well, you tell her to get well soon. It's a crying shame to stay inside on a day like this." I didn't wait for her to ask anything else. I ran for the front door, fumbling with the key, and ducked inside. I leaned against the door, breathing hard in the dark, silent hallway. I looked at my hands. They were shaking. I wasn't just a ghost anymore. I was a ghost who had been spotted. By day 14, the house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a waiting room. I had hauled the rotting food to a dumpster behind a nearby gas station, so the smell was gone, but the air remained thick and dead. My clothes were the biggest problem. My favorite t-shirt was stiff with sweat and dirt from my audits. Since the washing machine was a giant, useless box of metal without power, I found an old plastic bucket in the garage. I filled it at the park fountain, lugged it back, and sat on the back porch to scrub my clothes with a sliver of hand soap. I was leaning over the bucket, my knuckles raw and red, when a shadow fell over me. "That's no way to get the stains out of cotton, Hazel." I jumped, nearly knocking the bucket over. Mrs. Gable was standing at the edge of the porch, holding a plate covered with aluminum foil. She wasn't looking at me with pity, she was looking at me with a terrifying, sharp intelligence. Your mom is in Europe, Hazel. I saw her Facebook post, "Finding my soul in Florence," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dry as parchment. "She's been gone 2 weeks, and you've been living like a stray cat." I felt the heat rush to my face, a stinging shame that made my eyes prickle. I gripped the wet shirt in the bucket until my fingernails dug into my palms. "I'm doing fine. I have a garden. I have money." "You have $2 and a bag of soda cans," she countered. She stepped onto the porch and sat in the rusted metal chair next to me. "I've been watching you. You're smart, you're tough, but you're still a child who needs a hot meal that didn't come out of a library trash can." She set the plate down. The smell hit me like a physical blow. Fried chicken, buttery mashed potatoes, and green beans. My mouth watered so suddenly it hurt. "I'm not a charity case," I whispered, though my stomach gave a traitorous growl. "I don't believe in charity," Mrs. Gable said firmly. "I believe in labor. My joints are too stiff to pull the crabgrass out of my flower beds, and my windows haven't been washed since the Reagan administration. You work for me 3 hours a day. In exchange, you eat at my table, and you use my laundry machine. Do we have a deal?" I looked at the plate, then at the gray, soapy water in my bucket, and finally at the old woman. She wasn't offering to save me, she was offering me a job. It was the first time in 2 weeks I felt like I had a choice. "Deal," I said. That afternoon, I sat in Mrs. Gable's kitchen. It was the opposite of our house. It was bright, the air conditioner hummed a steady, cool song, and it smelled like lemon wax and baking soda. As I ate, Mrs. Gable didn't ask me about Eleanor. She talked about the weather, her late husband, and the best way to prune roses. For the first time since the taxi pulled away, the knot in my chest loosened. I realized something as I watched her dry a dish. A house wasn't just a building with power. It was a place where someone noticed if you were hungry. Eleanor had the power on, but the house was always dark. Mrs. Gable's house was full of light. And as I walked back to my silent, empty tomb that evening, I realized I didn't want to go back to being Eleanor's sturdy little girl. I wanted to be someone who deserved to be seen. The first radish was small, misshapen, and covered in grit, but to me it looked like a ruby. It was day 21. I pulled it from the earth, washed it under the garden hose at Mrs. Gable's house, and bit into it. It was sharp and peppery, a stinging heat that woke up my tongue. It tasted like work. It tasted like I wasn't dead yet. My life had settled into a rhythmic, grueling routine. Mornings were for the audit, scouring the ditches for the glint of aluminum. Afternoons were spent at Mrs. Gable's. I scrubbed her baseboards until my knees ached, and polished her silver until my reflection looked back at me, hollow-cheeked but steady. "You're growing, Hazel," Mrs. Gable remarked one afternoon as I reached up to dust a high shelf. I looked down at my feet. My sneakers, once white but now a permanent shade of road grime gray, were splitting at the seams. My toes were cramped against the rubber tips, aching with every step. My t-shirt, the one I had washed a dozen times in a bucket, barely reached my waist anymore. "I guess," I said, jumping down. "It's not just height," she said, peering at me over her glasses. "You've got a look in your eye, like a wolf that's figured out how to open the gate." I didn't tell her that I had a hidden stash. Under the loose floorboard in my bedroom, I had a glass jar. It was filled with $48.65, all in nickels, dimes, and the crumpled singles Mrs. Gable paid me. It was more money than I had ever held in my life. It was my after fund. I didn't know what after looked like yet, but I knew I was buying my way toward it, one soda can at a time. The silence of my own house didn't scare me anymore. I had learned to live in the dark. I knew which floorboards creaked and how to navigate the kitchen by the moonlight hitting the linoleum. I was a tenant in a house that used to be a home. One evening, as I walked back from Mrs. Gable's with a sandwich wrapped in a napkin, I saw a flash of light in the kitchen window. My heart lurched. Was the power back? Had she come home early? I ran to the door, my two small shoes pinching my heels. I burst inside. The house was still dark. The flash of light had just been a reflection of a passing car's headlights on the glass. But as I stood in the stifling heat of the hallway, I heard something that made my skin prickle. Beep. A small red light was blinking on the old answering machine in the kitchen. It was running on the backup batteries I'd found in a drawer. I pressed the button. The tape whirred, a ghostly mechanical sound. "Hazel? Honey, it's Mom." The voice was loud, jarringly bright, and completely foreign. She sounded like she was calling from another planet. "Italy is divine. I met the most amazing people in Rome. I'm catching my flight tomorrow morning. I can't wait to tell you everything. I hope you saved those $2 for something special. See you soon, baby." End of messages. I stood in the dark, the red light blinking like a slow, bleeding heartbeat. She sounded so happy. She sounded like she had just gone to the grocery store for 20 minutes. She hadn't asked if I was okay. She hadn't asked if the food lasted. She hadn't even asked if I was still there. I looked at my dirty, calloused hands. I looked at my bruised shins. I realized then that the girl she left behind, the one who would have run to the door and hugged her, was gone. That girl had starved to death in the first week. I went to my room, pulled up the floorboard, and grabbed my jar of money. I didn't pack a suitcase. I didn't need anything from this house. I walked back across the lawn to Mrs. Gable's house. I didn't knock. I just sat on her porch steps and waited for the sun to come up. The sun didn't just rise that morning. It bruised the sky purple and orange before turning into a flat, punishing white. I was still sitting on Mrs. Gable's porch when the taxi pulled into our driveway at 8 a.m. I watched from the shadows of the porch eaves, my knees pulled up to my chin. My jar of money sat between my feet, a heavy weight of glass and metal. The taxi door swung open, and out stepped Eleanor. She looked like a magazine cutout. She was wearing a flowing white linen dress and a wide-brimmed straw hat. Her skin was a deep, toasted bronze, and she was laughing as she tipped the driver. She looked rested. She looked like someone who had never known a moment of hunger or thirst in her entire life. She hauled a new, smaller suitcase, leather, probably Italian, onto the gravel. She waved at the driver and turned to the house. I watched her skip up the front steps. She was humming. She reached for the door handle, then paused, looking at the overflowing mailbox. She plucked a handful of envelopes out, gave them a confused look, and shoved them into her bag. Then she unlocked the door and stepped inside. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. I imagined the smell hitting her, the stale 90-degree air, the scent of dust, and the faint, lingering ghost of the rotting milk. I imagined her looking at the dark kitchen, the dead lights, and the pile of infested pasta still on the floor where I had dropped it weeks ago. A minute passed, then 2. Then the front door burst open. Eleanor ran out onto the porch, her hat falling off and rolling down the steps. "Hazel?" she screamed. Her voice was high and thin, cracking with a sudden, sharp panic. "Hazel, are you in there? It's Mom!" She ran back inside, and I could hear her footsteps thundering through the house. She was calling my name over and over, her voice moving from the kitchen to the living room, then up the stairs to my empty bedroom. I stood up slowly. My legs felt stiff like old wood. Mrs. Gable opened her screen door and stood beside me. She didn't say a word, she just placed a cool, dry hand on my shoulder. Eleanor came back out. She was hyperventilating, her face flushed red under her tan. She looked toward Mrs. Gable's house, her eyes wide and wild. She saw me. "Hazel?" She scrambled down the steps of our house and sprinted across the lawn. "Oh my God, Hazel! I thought... The house is... Why is it so dark? Why are you over here?" She reached out to grab me, to pull me into a hug that smelled like expensive duty-free perfume and sweat. I stepped back. I didn't do it quickly or angrily. I just moved out of her reach, the way you'd avoid a puddle. She froze, her arms hanging empty in the air. "The power was out, Mom," I said. My voice sounded flat, even to my own ears. The water, too. The food was full of bugs. I must have forgotten the bill," she stammered, her eyes darting around. "It was a mistake, honey, a silly, stupid mistake, but I'm home now. Look, I got you a gift. It's a necklace from a little shop near the Pantheon." She reached into her bag, her hands shaking. "I don't want a necklace. I wanted a sandwich 2 weeks ago." "Don't be like that," she said, her voice turning sharp, the old Eleanor peeking through. "I left you money. I left you $2. You're a resourceful girl, Hazel. I knew you'd manage. It was meant to be a lesson in independence." I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the selfishness in the curve of her mouth and the way she couldn't look me in the eye for more than a second. I learned the lesson. I learned that I don't belong to you anymore. Eleanor stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. Her sturdy little girl had grown a spine of cold iron, and she didn't know how to break it. "You're being dramatic, Hazel. You're tired. Let's go inside, get the lights back on, and we'll have a nice dinner," she said, her voice trembling with a forced, manic cheerfulness. "The house is dead, Mom," I said, my voice as steady as the horizon. "I'm not going back in there." Mrs. Gable stepped forward, her presence like a solid wall between me and the woman in the white linen dress. "The girl is staying with me until the authorities arrive, Eleanor. I've already called them. Child services should be here in 20 minutes. Eleanor's face went pale, the tan suddenly looking like a mask of yellow clay. "You called the police over a summer trip? You're overstepping, Clara." "I'm stepping exactly where I need to be," Mrs. Gable replied. Eleanor turned back to me, desperation leaking out of her eyes. "Hazel, tell her we're fine. I'll buy you anything you want. We'll go to the mall. We'll get those sneakers you wanted." I looked down at my splitting shoes, the gray road dust ground into the fabric. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the 2 original crumpled dollar bills. They were soft and limp from the humidity of my room. I walked down the porch steps, crossed the small gap between us, and held them out. "I don't want sneakers," I said, "and I don't want these. I earned my own money. I grew my own food. I didn't need you to survive, and that's the part you're actually mad about." I dropped the bills at her feet. They fluttered in the hot breeze, landing in the dry grass. Eleanor looked at the money, then at me, and for the first time she went silent. The free spirit was gone. She just looked like a small, selfish woman who had forgotten her most important job. When the social worker arrived, Eleanor cried and made excuses about independence and misunderstandings, but the evidence was everywhere: the dark house, the spoiled food, the weight I had lost, and the callus on my palm from Mrs. Gable's garden hoe. I left that afternoon. I didn't take much, just my jar of money and the clothes I had scrubbed in a bucket. I went to live with my Aunt Sarah 3 towns over. She didn't have silk blouses or stories about Italy, but she had a refrigerator full of milk, and she never let the lights go out. 19 years later. I am 30 years old now. I live in a city far away from that suburban street. My blonde hair is cut short now, and I wear suits that fit me perfectly. I am a woman who values security, punctuality, and a full pantry. I haven't seen Eleanor in a decade. The last time we spoke, she tried to tell me a story about a cruise she wanted to take. I hung up the phone before she finished. I didn't hate her anymore. She was just a stranger I used to know. I have an office with a large window. On the wall behind my desk is a small, simple frame. Inside are 2 old, wrinkled $1 bills. My assistant asked me once why I kept them. She thought they were my first dollars from a business. I just smiled and told her they were a receipt. They were the price my mother paid to lose me, and they were the price I paid to find myself. I look at those bills every morning. They remind me that I am never truly alone, because I am the person who survived. I am the girl who grew radishes in the dark, and I am the woman who will never, ever be left behind again.